Hey class, so last time we talked about the Manchurian Crisis, which really demonstrated the weaknesses of the League of Nations. This time we're going to look at the other crisis, known as the Abyssinian Crisis, which really punctuates the weaknesses of the League of Nations once again. Also, it is the kind of like the leading factors that really pushes Mussolini to ally with Hitler and kind of form the bad guy team, the Axis of World War II, the bad guys, essentially. So let's begin. At that time, the leader of Italy was the man Mussolini, also known as Il Duce, and he was the prime minister of Italy at that time. By 1935, with Britain and France seeing the rise of Hitler, they really began to sort of worry about Hitler becoming a major problem in international affairs. So they decided to form kind of an alliance between France, Britain, and Italy, because Italy was very instrumental in kind of containing Germany in 1934 when Germany tried to reunite with Austria via an Anschluss. And while Hitler was attempting this Anschluss, Mussolini had his army, situated at the borders of Italy, between Italy and Austria, and it really made Hitler reconsider his position, and basically back off because of that. So Mussolini at that time was kind of seen as an advocate for peace and someone fighting for the good of the people. And so they included Italy into the Stresa Front. Italy was also interested in joining the Stresa Front, mainly because of the Abyssinian Crisis, but we'll elaborate on that later on. In 1935, after Italy joins the Stresa Front, Britain also forms the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which was really one of the early, as I said earlier, in a naval disarmament treaties video, which is really kind of one of the signs of appeasement with Britain unilaterally allowing Germany to have a navy, which basically goes against everything that the Treaty of Versailles is about. In 1935, afterwards, it leads to the invasion of Abyssinia, and at the end of the Abyssinian Crisis, the Italians also form an alliance with Hitler in Germany, and basically form the Rome-Berlin axis. Backtracking a little bit, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, Britain did not inform her Stresa allies about that, and so once again, it's a unilateral decision. So let's talk. That's kind of the big picture of what happened in kind of like the macro European history. Let's look at the more detailed relationship between Italy and Abyssinia. Italy and Abyssinia both were members of the League of Nations. Both were signatories of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was the agreement not to use war as a means for international affairs to achieve their international goals. And they were also, because of the whole collective security and because they were both members of the League of Nations, they also signed the Italo-Ethiopian Treaty of Friendship, which essentially guaranteed 20 years of friendship after joining the League of Nations. So that happened around 1921, 1922. But why did Italy want to invade Abyssinia in 1935? Well, because first of all, Italy lost. If you need to sign a treaty of friendship, obviously things weren't going very well between Italy and Abyssinia before the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. And essentially, at that time, Italy lost its first war in 1896 in a war between Abyssinia and Italy. And therefore, there's kind of a mentality of revanche, once again, a revenge for what happened earlier. There was also an era, once again, similar to Japan, with the Great Depression. 1929 hits, everyone's in a bad economic shape, and Italy really needed to exert its imperialist policies in order to guarantee themselves raw materials, markets, and territory for the growing Italian population. So once again, you have the same themes as Japan in why Italy needed to expand to Abyssinia. So how did it go? And here's kind of and most of the stuff happened between 1934 and 1935 rather quickly. In 1934, the Italians started a conflict near the Abyssinian border at the Wawal Oasis, leading to a conflict called the Wawal Incident. And in that incident, basically there was a skirmish between Italian along with their Somalian allies, against the Ethiopians. And basically, in this little skirmish, around 100 Ethiopians died, around 30 Italians, and 50 Somalis. And this skirmish was over one of the forts near that area. And Mussolini essentially demanded a compensation for the 30 dead soldiers. Haile Selassie, the leader of Abyssinia, then appeals to the League of Nations and says, please come in and resolve this issue, because once again, if you're a member of the League of Nations and also a signatory of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, you can't fight. And you need the League of Nations to come in, and you basically agree that the League of Nations will resolve all conflicts for you. And so he appeals to the League of Nations. The League of Nations looks at the issue, and they're both absolved of guilt. However, over time, through January to July of 1935, the Italians slowly increased their military presence near Abyssinia and in Abyssinia as well. And so Haile Selassie, as a result of this, continually appeals to the League of Nations and say, hey, you guys got to come in and arbitrate. You need to come in and take a look. And they felt there was kind of a lack of resolution to the whole Wawal incident and the conflict that took place there. And so the League of Nations then decides to take a look at it, and essentially by July of 1935, the League of Nations puts an arms embargo on both parties, saying you are both not allowed to build up an army. Stop building up an army. Stop building weapons. Stop producing weapons. Stop importing weapons. Just stop all military buildup. And Abyssinia follows. However, the Italians did not follow this. So over time, until the conflict actually breaks out in October, the Italians were able to bring in more and more soldiers and rally their forces, while the Abyssinians really did not build up an army. And so that leads to kind of why the Abyssinians really lost quite quickly once the war breaks out. Finally, by July 1935, once again, the arms embargo takes place, but also the arbitration also takes place, and both parties are exonerated of guilt. They're both not guilty for the Wawal incident, because both had more or less a right to see that territory as their own. The Italians had a fort there, and that territory was also in Ethiopia. So both parties were exonerated. They really didn't want any problems with Italy. However, during the arbitration, they were allowed to talk about the issues of the fight and the guilt and so on, but they were really not allowed to talk. But the League of Nations really did not want to talk about the issues of sovereignty, and which basically, as a result of that, it denies Abyssinia the use of the instruments of the League of Nations and gives in to Mussolini. Because remember, one of the main ideas behind the League of Nations is self-determination, right? But if the issues of sovereignty of the Wawal Oasis is not granted to Abyssinia, basically Abyssinia cannot say have self-determination in that territory, And so this already kind of goes against the principles of the League of Nations. France and Britain also offered concessions to which really emboldened Mussolini, and such concessions include limited economic sanctions. So once again, like I said before, there was three instruments for the League of Nations. There was number one, moral persuasion; number two, economic sanctions; and number three, military use. Right, and so France and Britain only agreed to a limited economic sanctions against Italy. So moving on, we're gonna take a quick look at two videos that really highlights the whole Abyssinian crisis.
To a time when the emperor first became a symbol of his country and of all Africa. Only a veteran can now remember when the last and most brutal chapter of the European scramble for Africa began. 1935, Italy claimed Ethiopia and Mussolini's troops invaded. To a time when the emperor first became a symbol of his country and of all Africa. Only a veteran can now remember when the last and most brutal chapter of the European scramble for Africa began. 1935, Italy claimed Ethiopia and Mussolini's troops invaded.
Arriverà al benessere, alla potenza e alla gloria. Black men, the bugle call, come on, come on, the drums are beating and the bugle call, come on, don't mind what Mussolini said, let us march in battle array, and take the gun in our hand and defend the Ethiopian war, declare.
At the League of Nations in Geneva, the Emperor went to plead Ethiopia's just cause. The League, fearful of a shadow which would turn into the Second World War, did nothing. Shamefully, the great powers left Ethiopia to Mussolini and the Emperor to lonely exile in England.
His Majesty Negus Haile Selassie, I call upon the first delegate of Ethiopia.
Nowhere, I think, was the Emperor's tragedy felt more deeply than among the black people of the West, the slave descendants in North America and the Caribbean. Black consciousness had dawned in Jazz Age Harlem, and Africa fermented in the exiles' hearts. Many supported a black activist called Marcus Garvey, and when he demanded Africa for the Africans and repatriation to the homeland, they saw Ethiopia as a special symbol of the whole continent. Until now, it alone had not been seized by white Europeans. Such people volunteered to fight for Haile Selassie, although only a handful managed to go, or they organized to send relief.
Black Americans rallied towards the cause, and black Jamaicans likewise, and so the organization was formed in New York, 105th to 1 Lenox Avenue, New York, and as Ethiopian World Federation Incorporated. Those people gave up monies, medicine, clothes, and what have you, and sent into Haile Selassie.
A branch of the Ethiopian World Federation soon opened in Jamaica, where Garvey came from. But in this neglected corner of the British Empire, black frustration had a new twist. A few ex-followers of Garvey had begun to mix Haile Selassie, symbol of Africa, with biblical notions of a Messiah. By abbreviating Jehovah, or Yahweh, to Jah, and adding this to the emperor's earlier name, Rastafari, they created the invocation Jah Rastafari, a black Messiah for their redemption. It would be years before any followers of the Rastafarian faith reached Ethiopia. The emperor knew nothing about them, as he himself returned, with British military help, to reclaim his throne.
Look what Mussolini is trying to do. Take a bigger mouthful than any man can do. The drums are beating and the bugle call, but we cannot let the Lion of Judah fall. So let us take a run in our hand and defend the Ethiopian war. Declare.
Shoulders and left many blind. The fumes burned lungs. People died from drinking poisoned water. The horrified Red Cross volunteers were not equipped to treat gas burns. Mustard gas was outlawed by international agreement after World War I. Mussolini authorized its widespread use to bring about the quick victory which would justify his huge investment in the war.
The first and natural effect was shock and bewilderment. The Ethiopians have been used to fighting for their independence for decades, but this was a different kind of invasion with the most modern weapons and very massive use of them. So initially the shock was the first important effect. Gradually, however, Ethiopians began to react, to pool their resources, to pull whatever they have within them, and to fight in every possible way.
But while the patriots began to organize themselves, the newsreels gave no hint of Ethiopian resistance.
Abyssinia is Italian. That was the dute's pronouncement to the world when Mauro Badoglio climaxed his triumphant campaign. Advancing after the last pitched battle, the invaders came within a short march of Addis Ababa. Before they entered its gates, the Abyssinian capital was almost literally reduced to ashes. Street after street of ruins symbolized the complete overthrow of the Abyssinian Empire. Alone of newsreel photographers, Paramount News cameraman John Dorrid remained at his post. All others took the Emperor's advice and left the city before the looting began. Our pictures of the sacking of Addis Ababa therefore have unique historical interest. Thus the invaders have belied all the prophets and supposed experts, ended the war, and compelled the virtual surrender of Abyssinia into their hands. We would once more stress the fact that it is not the function of British Paramount News to comment on this war. All along, we have impartially presented a graphic record of the campaign, leaving it to you, if you saw fit, to sympathize with one side or the other. Now the Emperor's cause is lost. Abyssinia, says Il Duce, is henceforth Italian.
With the fall of his capital, Addis Ababa, Haile Selassie, the Lion of Judah, sought sanctuary in Britain. The world might deem Ethiopia none of its business, yet, like it or not, the presence of that dignified figure on English soil was a reminder to the world of its conscience.
ይሄ በጣም አሳዛኝ ሆኖ ነው የተሰማን። ነገር ግን
This was a very sad piece of news to me. People had thought he would stay and lead them and fight with them. They never believed he would abandon them. It was a very serious matter. In the whole history of Ethiopia, he was the first and last king to do such a shameful thing. It was something we all condemned. History will judge him.
የሚወገዝ ድርጊት ነው ያደረጉት። ታሪክ ፈረዳቸዋል።
Meanwhile, the Negus is in Geneva, where in the new League of Nations palace, seen in the background, he comes to present his plea to the nation.
Gentlemen, Speaker on His Majesty Negus Haile Selassie. I call upon the first delegate to Ethiopia.
Monsieur le Président.
So in an unprecedented scene, Haile Selassie stands in dignified silence, waiting for the uproar created by Italian journalists to cease.
When the whistling did subside, the emperor pointed out that in spite of the League's condemnation, Italy's invasion had resulted in the occupation of his country. What action would the League now take? As he declared, God and history will remember your judgment.
And amid a very moved gathering, the emperor descends from the rostrum to resume his seat among the delegates.
Because this Italian invasion of Ethiopia was intertwined with, at the time, European politics, European struggles. This was, as you know, the eve of World War II. It became difficult for many countries like Britain, for instance, or like France, to mention just a couple, to have the moral fortitude to decide as a matter of principle against aggression and for the victim. And so they failed to take that necessary step, and as a result, the League itself also floundered.
Great as is the League, the ends that it exists to serve are greater than itself, and the greatest of these ends is peace. Thus Britain's spokesman, Lord Halifax, here seen arriving for the momentous council meeting. Monsieur Bonnet, French foreign minister, supports the British proposal that members should decide for themselves whether to recognize Italy's conquest of Abyssinia, while Mr. Taizaz and Mr. Medan are present as Ethiopia's delegates.
Meanwhile, far away in Africa, the tramp of soldiers' feet again, oft-times bare. The battle was now nearly over, but though the end was near, morale was still high.
In the council chamber, the session, which is presided over by Dr. Munters of Latvia, arrives at a speedy conclusion and Lord Halifax's proposal is adopted. This in practice means the recognition that Abyssinia is Italian, a bitter result for Haile Selassie, emperor without a throne, too ill, as he said, to address his own speech to the council. He returns to London a dejected but still dignified figure and passes through the city on the way back to his retreat in the west of England.
So, in spite of massive public support in Britain for the Ethiopian cause, the Western governments had recognized Mussolini's annexation of Ethiopia. The Italians celebrated in the streets of Addis.
Immediately after the occupation of Addis Ababa, a colonial conference was held in Trieste, which proclaimed that there should be rigid division between the races.
Whites and blacks couldn't eat or drink together. Even the housing was all segregated.
Minister Teruzzi is at this very moment carrying out the express wishes of our leader as he puts the finishing touches to his plans for the new capital of the Italian Empire of Ethiopia. The purifying flames raise to the ground these filthy hovels, dens of disease and degradation. The flames do their duty, purging thoroughly and drastically, definitively. Hundreds of our brave firemen have been mobilized for the urgent program of urban resanitization.
Altogether, 20,000 people were forcibly ejected and their houses burned. They were moved to a specially designed native quarter.
Here, in the northwest quarter, a huge new estate has already been completed. The little brick houses are now ready to receive the inhabitants who have been evacuated from the old slum. This is the first evidence of how the future city will look. The natives are to be separated into different groups according to race and religion.
One has to appreciate the fact that although the Italians symbolically occupied Addis Ababa, the capital, they by no means occupied the country. This was not a colonial situation as such, it was an occupation, a partial occupation, but they never had peace for the moment, even in Addis. Just a few meters from here we have the Yekatit 12 monument, which commemorates the massacre that was inflicted upon the people of Addis Ababa because a couple of Ethiopians threw bombs at the then Italian viceroy here, Graziani.
It was at one of these public appearances that the bombs were thrown. Graziani's response was brutal.
They burned down houses and went around killing people for 3 whole days. Of course there was complete segregation everywhere.
Graziani became known as the Butcher of Addis Ababa. But in spite of his brutality, he failed to crush the patriotic resistance, even inside the capital.
And this is the headquarters of the man who at his emperor's command held up the flag of Ethiopian liberty for 5 years. Ras Ababa Aragai, one of the bravest men in the modern world. Ababa Aragai has spent the past 5 years never more than 100 miles from Addis Ababa. With a price on his head, he's been wounded in battle half a dozen times.
So from the first video, you could see that the impact of the Abyssinian crisis internationally cannot be mitigated. In fact, there's the black population within America and all the way down to Jamaica was greatly shaken by what was taking place in Abyssinia. And in fact, if you go to Jamaica today, there's actually a religion called Rastafarianism, which is kind of like a mix of Christianity with the Abyssinian crisis, and where they have Haile Selassie as an important figure within their religion. And in fact, one person who practices this religion, that's one of the most famous person, is Bob Marley, the person who sings "No Woman, No Cry." The second video is more about how Mussolini really violates all the rules laid out by the League of Nations. And as you can see, the use of poison gas was made illegal after World War I, but Italy, in order to hasten the war, decided to use it. Also, when Haile Selassie was appealing to the League, there were many times where he was ridiculed. For example, in that speech that he gave, he was ridiculed by Italian journalists within that forum, and which is when you think about it, quite interesting, to say the least. There's also the fact that when you see the amount of the amount of how much France and Britain really lets Italy get away with everything is also quite interesting, and you see how they do one time and again they cede to Italy's will, refusing to stand in its way and create conflict, and you really see what kind of a predicament Haile Selassie is placed into. The speech that he gave to the League of Nations is one of the things that we will be looking at later on. And I feel personally that it's quite a powerful speech, and in fact, when I read it, I was quite moved. There's also the fact that within the whole Abyssinian crisis, within the international news, there really wasn't much emphasis placed onto it. But meanwhile, the atrocities within Abyssinia were quite severe, and and so it's like when you think about all the lack of press coverage that we have on tragedies today, it was already happening back then. Anyways, moving on, let's talk about the economic sanctions that took place afterwards. As I said earlier, Britain and the rest of the League was intent on putting economic sanctions as kind of a punishment or as kind of a deterrent for Italy to continue on with the war. However, as I stated earlier, they also agreed only on a limited economic sanction. They were, like I said before, there were three tools that the League of Nations could use. Number one is moral persuasion. Number two is economic sanctions. Number three is military use. And people were pretty much against the use of military at that time. And so, on October 3rd, 1935, with the invasion of Abyssinia, the economic sanctions had to be put into place. However, a couple of problems that really revealed the weaknesses of the League. Number one, it took way too long for it to take place. Number two, it excluded core materials and resources such as coal, oil, and steel, which really allowed Italy to continue on with their war. If the League cut off these resources, Italy would be hard pressed to continue on with the war. But these and people were well aware of it, but these resources were not cut off. Furthermore, there was disunity amongst the League, where the USA, Japan, Germany, and other countries continued to trade with Italy, even though there was supposed to be an economic sanction. Last but not least, the Suez Canal is quite critical in that Britain and France withdrew their navies so that the Italians could have access to the Suez Canal and actually send reinforcements to Italian Somaliland, which is pretty much their base of launching attacks into Abyssinia. And so if you look at it geographically, instead of having Italy send their resources down along the western coast of Africa, over the Cape of Good Hope and up the eastern coast of Africa, the Italians actually had a shortcut to go straight through the Suez Canal to arrive at Somaliland to land their resources to aid in the fight. There were a couple of reactions to the to this whole fiasco, and particularly we're going to look at Britain and France. First of all, why was Britain willing to back off? And first of all, they were willing to back off because they wanted to avoid a war in the Mediterranean, particularly at Malta and Gibraltar, to preserve strength to fight the Japanese aggression in the Pacific. Please remember, at this time, Japan was already, the Manchurian crisis has already happened, and the intentions of the Japanese was quite apparent by that time. And so Britain was well aware of it, and being a naval power, they wanted to preserve strength to deal with the Japanese for their Asian interests. France had two reasons why they reacted the way they did. Number one, they wanted to help protect the French Mediterranean coast in case of war against Germany, to avoid a two-front war. And so, remember, at that time, Hitler was already in power and was already getting quite aggressive. So so France was kind of antsy about Germany as a prospect for war. Another thing is Italy. If France got in the way of Italy, it would be bad for the Little Entente. And the Little Entente was an alliance formed in 1920 and 1921 between Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. The purpose of this Little Entente was to kind of create a common defense against the Hungarian revision and a prevention of a Habsburg restoration, which is pretty much the reunification of Austria and Hungary, or the rise of in the case of a rise of a belligerent Hungary. This Little Entente is also significant because it was on the eastern. It would be on the eastern front, because the common ally for everyone by that time, Russia, was already communist, and so in order to keep pressure on the eastern front of Germany, Austria, and Hungary, it would be wise to have an ally, and the Little Entente served that role. The Little Entente would also want this to be the case because since Germany signed the Locarno Treaty guaranteeing the western borders, but really no eastern borders, the eastern borders were not agreed upon, and therefore there was always a chance of Germany reneging on the Treaty of Versailles and being an aggressor upon those newly founded states. And so France did not really want to get in the way of Italy, because that would make them an enemy of Italy, resulting in a conflict and pretty much jeopardizing the Little Entente. Also, at that time, the general public sentiment for all the nations was all sanctions short of a war. So pretty much no one wanted a war. Everyone was willing to go to the second degree, so moral persuasion and economic sanctions, but really no one was willing to go to the third one, the use of the military. And particularly with the Great Depression being in full slide at that time. So Britain and France was involved with trying to strike up a deal to resolve this conflict, which led to the Hoare-Laval Pact. Now, this Hoare-Laval Pact never actually took place, but in fact was a secret deal between made by Hoare, who is a minister of Britain, and Laval, who was French, and which pretty much guaranteed the end of the war, but it would grant access to Mussolini to large parts of Ethiopia. And if you look at the map that's on the screen right now, you'll have the territory right next to Eritrea and Italian Somaliland pretty much become Italian territory, along with almost half of Ethiopia in the south become an area of Italian economic influence. Although Mussolini would not get Addis Ababa, pretty much he would achieve his goals. So Mussolini agreed to the Hoare-Laval Pact. However, this was seen as a motion for France and Britain of appeasement, and when this information was somehow leaked to the media, people were outraged, and to the degree that Hoare and Laval actually had to resign from their posts because they called them out, saying that they're playing a double game. Remember, in the Treaty of Versailles, one of the main things that was in Wilson's 14 points was against the existence of secret alliances and secret deals and so on. And the Hoare-Laval Pact went against the spirit of this, and it was quite apparent that Britain and France was not serious about the principles of the League. At least it showed it gave this perception. So this led to public outcry and pretty much villainized Italy against any possibility of going back to the league again. So Italy actually turns its back on the league, like it was going to do it anyways, and Mussolini turns to Hitler, resulting in the formation of the Rome-Berlin axis. Pretty much, and this is kind of like the beginning of the bad guys being grouping together before World War II happens, and Japan joins them later on, and to form the Axis powers, and kind of like the board game Axis and Allies. And by that time, by the end of the war, or pretty much the beginning of World War II, 3/4 of Abyssinia was already conquered, and Haile Selassie had to go into exile into Britain, as seen in the previous video, the second video. So what were the effects of the Abyssinian Crisis? The Abyssinian Crisis really showed a couple of things. First of all, it showed that collective security was a failure, that the League of Nations was weak, the stress up front was too tense, and it pretty much had to end because Italy couldn't agree, get into terms with Britain and France with what they did, even though Italy joined the stress up front in the first place, kind of to get their way with the Abyssinian Crisis. And so Italy in turn signs on and jumps on board with Hitler, forming the Rome-Berlin axis, and also leaves the League of Nations in 1937. And I made a mistake earlier. I said that Hitler's invasion of Austria, or the Anschluss of Austria, but rather it wasn't the Anschluss of Austria. It was the invasion of the Rhineland, which really kept Britain and France on their toes while they were busy with Abyssinia. And so those were the effects of the Abyssinian Crisis, which really sets the stage for the European theater of World War II. So why did the League of Nations fail in general, which is kind of the main thing that we're looking at between the Manchurian Crisis and also the Abyssinian Crisis. There's this acronym that's quite useful. It was dumb. Weak, America, structure, depression, unsuccessful members, and big bullies. And this is pretty much identical with the last slide in the Manchurian Crisis as well. Weak would stand for the League's power was little. They were more than shaking their head and saying, bad boy. They really couldn't do much. The sanctions did not work, and the League of Nations had no army. Number two, America, which was the strongest nation in the world at that time, never joined, and Britain and France were not strong enough to impose the peace on their own. They keep the peace, and the next one is the structure of the League of the Nations was very muddled, and it took ages to do anything. Members of the League of Nations could not agree, but decisions always had to be unanimous. And this pretty much paralyzed the League, and they couldn't get anything done in time. The Depression, the Great Depression at that time, Worldwide Depression, made certain countries become more aggressive, such as Japan and Italy. On the other hand, it made other countries. Of course, I left out Germany. On the other hand, it left some other countries more worried about themselves rather than worried about world peace. And so that pretty much led to the failure of the economic sanctions, because some people simply refused to stop trading with Italy, which was a pretty good an economically sound country. The League of Nations also failed because previous unsuccessful experiences. The more of a league failed, the less people trusted it. In the end, everyone pretty much just ignored it, as Hitler did in his steps to war. The members of the League of Nations let it down. Particularly the main members, Italy and Japan defied it and left the League. France and Britain pretty much betrayed it. And the last thing is the big bullies. The League of Nations could not stand up against big bullies. In the 1920s, the League of Nations had some success with small and weak countries, but in the 1930s, powerful countries like Germany, Italy, and Japan defied the League, and they were too strong for the League to really stop them and do anything. Okay, and so that's really the significance of the Manchurian Crisis and the Abyssinian Crisis, and which really reveals the weaknesses of the League of Nations. In this particular, and some people argue that because of the weakness of the League of Nations, this really cleared the way for Hitler to do what he did in pushing the envelope leading to World War II.